This podcast is brought to you by Nuveen and Ruffer. Nuveen has provided investment excellence for 125 years. With expertise across income and alternatives, Nuveen continues to expand its capabilities while maintaining its legacy as a leading investment manager. Visit nuveen.com to learn more. Investing involves risk, loss of principal is possible. Ruffer is a London-based asset manager founded in 1994, managing over $25 billion for institutions, pension funds, charities, and individuals. They have a single investment approach that aims to deliver positive returns across the full range of market conditions. Investing involves risk, loss of principal is possible. Our next guest recently retired after a career of over 30 years in the area of private wealth in Dublin, Ireland. Hear from her the secrets of her success, how the industry evolved over the course of her career, and how her passion for the history of art influenced her professionally and will now chart a course for her retirement. I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Ciara Hurley, a fellow investment committee member at the Trinity College Dublin Endowment, where we have served together for a number of years. Ciara recently retired from Quilter Cheviot, where she was an executive director and private client investment manager for 19 years. Prior to that, she worked in Merrill Lynch and Goodbody Stockbrokers. She worked in the wealth management industry for 34 years, as well as serving in various director and board roles. Welcome, Ciara. Thanks for joining me here in person today.
Thank you, Aoife, for having me as your guest.
Well, let's start where we always start, which is with the background and career journey. Can you tell us where you grew up, what you studied, and how you came to enter the world of financial advice?
Sure. So I grew up in Dublin, Ireland. I studied, in terms of university, I studied in Trinity College Dublin in what at the time was ESS, now known as BESS. And I graduated with a business degree in 1987. After that, I went to UCD and completed a master's in banking and finance under the MBS programme. And after that, I decided I wanted to be a chartered accountant and joined Stokes County Crowley, now KPMG. But after a year, I decided that just was not for me. And I really knew that ultimately I wanted to work in the world of finance. So I left, and I was lucky because I then applied to a number of different stockbroking firms in Dublin. And I was offered a job in the private client department of Goodbody Stockbrokers as a trainee portfolio manager, and that was 1989.
Wow. So just going back, because we studied a few years apart at Trinity. I studied law, so I didn't even pursue economics. What was the male-female ratio at that time? And when you went to these interviews, did you find you were one of a few, or what were the numbers like?
So in university, there was a relatively high proportion of women, actually, interestingly enough, especially in UCD. But in terms of once I got into the world of stockbroking, that's where I was in a very significant minority. In fact, I was the only female portfolio manager for probably the guts of 10 years, which, to be honest, wasn't very daunting. I grew up in a family of boys and brothers, and so I never really saw that as an obstacle, and I was just very excited by the opportunity.
Well, speaking now about the world of financial advice, where you've 34 years, I think I've seen that. That was the number I read out. So can you just paint a picture as to how the environment changed, I suppose, over that time, the kind of clients you work for?
Sure. I think I was very lucky. I joined at a very exciting time. And like a lot of things, it doesn't necessarily feel very exciting at the time because you're just working very, very hard. But actually it was. And when I looked back on it in preparation for today's call, I realized that actually it coincided with a lot of big events like the Big Bang. Like ultimately in 1995, the Irish Stock Exchange becoming independent again from the LSE, the London Stock Exchange, after 20 years. It was a really vibrant time in terms of stock market activity, in particular quotations that were being achieved by Irish Indigenous firms for the first time. There had been a period, probably about 15 years before that, where there was a big lull. And then there was a new CEO came into the Irish Stock Exchange, and really Tom Healy, and he really, I think, was probably very significant in growing that culture of better stock market representation. So we saw companies coming onto the stock exchange like Kingspan and Lonbia and Ryanair, Paddy Power, a really interesting, flourishing time. And because Goodbody, which is where I started, had its own corporate finance arm, we got to meet a lot of these companies, and you actually got to meet businesses and meet the executives. So that was really exciting. And I was given lots of opportunity. I must say, I was thrown in at the deep end and I took every opportunity given to me. They were really good.
And in terms of the private wealth evolution, I suppose, so you mentioned Big Bang. There have been a few bangs in the backdrop since then. How, I suppose, have you held the hands of clients sort of through these ups and downs? And how did you start to see your role evolve?
Yeah. Well, there's a sort of a part to that, first of all, I should have really added in, which is the wealth profile changed dramatically in Ireland, which went in tandem with, if you like, the development of the stock market, the economies. Really, wealth started to be created in a very significant way. I touched on some of those companies that have got quoted, but there are a lot of businesses like that, or indeed those firms. So the opportunity set in terms of the creation of a new wealth market was really significant. So you went, I suppose, from intergenerational wealth largely and a small community of business where the money was concentrated to a really exciting development of new professionals, entrepreneurs, business owners. And we really capitalized on that. Now, with that comes different demands and a different client profile, because I suppose intergenerational wealth had a very long-term view on how wealth is managed. Newer wealth perhaps had different expectations, and that was really evident in the run-in to the dot-com crash, because they wanted it now, if you like. So that was an interesting lesson. I think ultimately, I worked with really good people who were conservative wealth managers who knew about taking the long-term approach, who were very blue chip in their approach to wealth management. And I think that's always stood to me, those lessons that I learned in the early days, not to compromise on value. And that really came out during the dot-com boom, because we were coming under a lot of pressure from particularly newer clients, I would say, to invest in these businesses. But they just, to our mind, had very little to sustain them. And we all know what happened. So that was a really interesting experience to have had, that it's good and bad. And you need to stick to your core values and beliefs and not compromise to what's a fad at the time.
And what are some of your core investment beliefs then?
So, I was thinking about that. So I think fundamentally, and they're very simple, they're things you hear repeated all the time, but certainly long-term focus has to be key to your whole financial planning and investment approach. So taking really the long term and having a really good plan that you put in place, reviewing it annually and seeing whether there's any rebalancing that needs to be done. But fundamentally, that plan and walking through that plan with your advisor. I worked very closely with clients, and I used to always say to them, you need to walk with me, because then what happens when the markets are bad, you don't have to panic. They're very comfortable staying with that plan, if you like. Diversification, really crucial. Just diversify. Don't have all your eggs in one basket. Quality is everything. As I said, fads come and go. But, if you stick with quality and you really know what you're investing in, that's another thing. You really need to understand what you're investing in. And if you don't understand it, you're better not to. And that's come true every single time. And the final thing I think is liquidity. I put a very high value on liquidity. And it was really evident how important that was in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, when, people couldn't sell property easily, for example. Now, we mightn't have liked the value of the stock market investments, but at least you could access them. Yeah. So I put a very high value on liquidity too.
And when you speak about that plan and walking with you, I think that's a wonderful image. Obviously, we talked about ups and downs as well. And sometimes macro events or exogenous events can get in the way of that plan, can scupper that plan.
Sure.
Just say there is a lot of property being held and the valuation has sunk, or a lot of banks' shares are being held and they sink. How often did you have to deal with maybe a plan that has to be completely recast?
Rarely, actually. Which sounds like I'm selling my own book, but in a way, that is the case. I was always very clear about, in a way, maybe I'm not the best example, because I always felt that if you really wanted to take excessive risk, I wasn't your person, right? So, and there were colleagues, I suppose, and other peers in different firms that I saw experiencing that. But I really fundamentally believe that if that is a good plan in the first place, and it's very high quality, and you understand what you're in, that you can stick through the worst of times. It's not to say you might need to liquidate part of it or whatever else, but fundamentally, that's a really good plan. So I didn't see too many complete reversals. In other words, I didn't have many clients who were very distressed sellers. So when there was a lot of leverage in the system, which we did see during the Celtic Tiger in particular, we, in our firm, the Quilter Cheviot, where I ended my career, was a very conservative firm, both before, during and after the crash. So we weren't compromised. So that leverage piece undid, as we know, a huge amount of value, and clients got very, very significantly hurt by that. For many of our clients who just were straight investment into the market, while it was really uncomfortable, largely they were able to stay the course. Now, if they had different obligations outside, that was a different thing. They might have needed to liquidate funds to meet those commitments. But from our perspective, I wouldn't say we had enormous change, no.
And now we bring you a message from one of our sponsors of this series, Nuveen. Nuveen has provided investment excellence for 125 years. A lot has changed, but one thing remains constant. Including different types of durable income in portfolios can help investors meet their goals. With expertise across income and alternatives, Nuveen continues to expand its capabilities while maintaining its legacy as a leading investment manager. Visit nuveen.com to learn more. Investing involves risk, loss of principal as possible. And now, back to the show. And then in terms of your other hallmarks as a professional besides investment beliefs, how did you approach developing business?
I was a bit of a terrier. I absolutely loved that part of it. I loved getting new clients. It was really exciting when you would achieve a new mandate and you get a really big piece of business. So I think, you kind of have to be competitive in our business. You have to have that drive of really wanting to grow your business. I was never waiting for other people to bring it to me. I went out and got it. And then I suppose what happens over a period of time is that the longer you're in business, you get great referrals from existing clients. And then you're doing things well and clients trust you with more of their assets. So I would say, first of all, you need to be driven. You need to be self-motivated. You need to go out and seek opportunities. You can't be shy in a way. But then I was curious about people. I loved meeting people in all walks of life, and you'd find out about their stories and you develop good relationships. And that was everywhere. The touch points are very wide when you start to think about it. I think sometimes people get very caught up on, it has to come through this channel or that channel. It's everywhere. It's having a curiosity about people and going out and meeting them and connecting with them. And then being committed, hardworking, and tenacious. Yeah.
That's a wonderful image. And can you then just kind of paint a picture of the wealth management landscape in Ireland? Because that probably is not as well understood by our listeners, maybe as in some other areas. Is it fragmented? Is it as dynamic and growing as much as it is around the world? How would you paint that picture?
It's changed an awful lot since I started. So back in 1989, when I joined the firm, it was a very small, I suppose, business sector, if you like. The stockbroking firms are largely where wealth was concentrated, and maybe one private bank. That really exploded into the late 90s, but more so the early 2000s, really, when the Celtic Tiger really manifested. So we had a lot of international players come in. Private banks started to spring up in the late 90s. A lot of firms tagged on wealth management arms, if you like. A lot of accountancy practices did things like that. And that was good and bad, because a lot of new players, again, were sort of driving a lot of leverage product through the system, a lot of property investment, etc. So it became a very, very busy place during that time, particularly during the Celtic Tiger. Now, obviously, we know what happened, and we saw a lot of firms either fail, merge, just close their doors and leave Ireland. And that was quite a tough time, actually. We were very lucky that we've gone through a number of different owners, Morgan Stanley, Citigroup, we then did a management buyout, etc. But the ultimate owner, Quilter, stayed with us throughout. So they were very committed to the long-term opportunity set, if you like. That wasn't always the case. So then when it settled down, we started to see more UK players interestingly come into the market. It's relatively still concentrated in about 5 or 6 material players. And then there's a number of other small players. But I think the reality is the cost of doing business is making it very difficult for smaller niche players to continue. And that's an issue in terms of competitiveness and consumer choice. But I think it's going to be a significant hallmark, if you like, of the sector going forward for the next few years.
And is some of that cost of doing business new regulation and regulatory obligations, compliance obligations?
I think, first of all, there's no doubt that the cost of doing business has largely been increased by the cost of compliance and regulation. That is, that's everywhere. We all know that. And there's a balance to be struck, isn't there? Yes, we probably had too light touch a regulation. Arguably, we really did. But we now have a fairly tight regulatory approach. And, the number of new directives and regulations coming it's extraordinary, the speed of them. And it's putting a lot of obligation on firms to gear up in that area. So that's a big cost to carry. So I don't know where that's going, but I suspect it's not going to change anytime soon. That's going to remain a cost for us.
How much does getting scale, because it enables you maybe to access different forms of investment, does that matter at all? Are clients as focused on the actual investments, or are they more focused on the relationship?
Yeah, I suspect we think about that more than clients do. I think clients, in some respects, they boil it down to a number of things. Do I trust this person? Is really important. In my experience, the relationships that you develop are really key. If they trust you, they'll stay with you. I've had a lot of clients say that to me over the years. I think the scale of the business is important, though, to a certain extent in the environment we live in, particularly after the crisis in terms of security. That became very much a thing that we got a lot more questions about, and justifiably so.
Yeah.
How secure are my assets? In fact, I would say to clients, and often said to many clients, that should be one of the first questions you ask, if you like, interviewing new firms.
Yeah.
How secure are my assets going to be? So to your point, in a way, that's also been part of what has led businesses to scale up, because they need to have that balance sheet and capital adequacy to give that comfort to clients. But I think other than that, a lot of the time, clients can be drawn into things that maybe they don't fully understand. So I do still feel very strongly that the responsibility is in the hands of the wealth manager to educate, to be transparent about what they're putting their clients into, to make sure they really understand the risks. Because I think there are clearly some clients who are very demanding and, very knowledgeable, but I would say the vast majority aren't.
Right. And I know I completely see that. And it's interesting, the focus on protection. I think whether it be cybersecurity protection there, generally protecting assets, capital preservation. And we've also seen in the US concerns around, say, the banks, or even the quick ability to pull money from a bank or a banking institution, a sign of just perhaps how jittery people are about the protection of their funds.
Yeah. And I think also the other thing that happened is that probably, and I think quite prudently as wealth has grown, that you don't leave all your assets with one institution, no matter how much you trust Ciara or whoever it is. I think that's prudent. In the same way as I was saying about diversification across assets, you should also diversify across your investment manager. I think that's only a prudent thing to do, not just from the point of view of the security of the institution, but you touched on cybersecurity. Yeah. So that has to be a real concern.
Yeah. Moving now to your board roles. At what stage of your career did you start taking on some of these roles, and what do you bring to your role as board member?
What do I hope I bring to that?
What do you seek to bring
as a board member? So my first board role was on the board of An Post, the Irish Postal Service Company, and it was a 5-year term. And I was asked to join at a time when they were looking at a joint venture between An Post and Fortis to form a bank, an independent, if you like, community-based bank. And it was at a time when there was a lot of money going to be released out of what was the special savings accounts, special savings accounts. That cash was going to be released. And so they saw that as an opportunity to bring money into the post office. So I joined then, and it was a really interesting experience, especially because what you realize, hopefully quite quickly, is that you're not an executive. You have to sit and give hopefully independent, external kind of opinions in an objective way to the board. You have to be able to look at things at a high strategic level. I think things like controls and risk management, what's your risk register like? And really make sure that you're comfortable with that. So I think also building good relationships with executives. And I suppose ultimately you hope that you build respect, that you question in a way that is not confrontational, it's hopefully collaborative, because at the end of the day, both of us should want the right outcome, the same outcome, right? But there are times when you have to stand your ground, and it's how you do that is really important. But it's understanding that, as I say, you don't get under the bonnet, you're not an executive in a day-to-day role anymore. So when you're working in a day-to-day role, it's quite interesting to then join a board and understand that subtle but important difference.
Eyes on, hands off. I've seen it as described it, or nose in, fingers out, or something like that.
Yeah.
And how about chairing? Have you had experience of good chairs, bad chairs? Any sense of what makes a good chair?
What is it exactly? It's a really good question. I think, again, in a way, there has to be a level of objectivity, but I suppose an ability to work with the CEO and his team, but to straddle that well with his board members, to have that impartiality, if you like, is really important. Communication, I think, especially with the non-executive directors, how they communicate is really important as well. And beyond that, I think a lot of it is just your gut instinct that this person likes this business, is interested in it, is invested in it. To me, it was really important. I was never going to join a board that I wasn't confident in the management team, that I didn't have a good feeling about its ethos. So that's really critical. And I suppose it's that old thing of top down. The culture comes from the top down. So the chair is part of that top down, isn't he or she? So they're important in terms of the signal they set.
I've definitely heard that joining a board where you align with their mission, and it's not just another board role. It actually is something that you relate to.
Absolutely.
Otherwise. Moving now to get some of my curiosity, and something that is I'd love to speak about is you're retired now. It was a recent decision the last year, and not a decision, but a recent move.
Yeah.
I'd love to know, because you have such a wealth of other interests, and history of art, I know, is among them. Can you talk about some of your plans for retirement, some of your priorities?
Thank you. So, yes, I retired at the end of last year, officially, really. So it's a big step, particularly when you've been very invested in your career for a very long time. But to be honest, I knew it was the right time to go. I'd had a really good career. I've been very fortunate. I've been given many opportunities. And I wanted to go in a way on a high when I was still enjoying it. But what I have done is I've retained two involvements, if you like, in the industry. One is with yourself as another colleague on the investment committee of the endowment fund for Trinity College. And we're both obviously alumni. And it's a really nice thing to be able to, I hope, give something back to our alma mater. And the second piece is I've just recently agreed to join as an advisor to the board of a specialist investment firm. I won't say who they are because we're still signing off all the paperwork. But that's a really nice way of, I suppose, keeping my experience tipping over and my interest in the whole business, because it is quite a passion that I've had. And then beyond that, I was very clear that I wanted to develop the other parts of my brain, so to speak, or as I said to somebody recently, you know, that life is a rainbow and I've only seen some of the colours. I haven't had the time. So it's about time. I really value time. So you touched on art history. So 20 years ago, believe it or not, I took a sabbatical and I studied history of art in Florence for a couple of months and then a couple of other Italian cities. Then I came back here and I did a diploma in the history of European painting in UCD. It was a 2-year diploma course, which I absolutely loved. But I really haven't had the same time to develop that. So now I do, which is great. And on that same sort of art-related theme, I love interior design, I'm really interested in it. I did a few courses in the Institute of Design in Kildare Street, so I intend taking that further along. I love hill walking. I want to get back into that. But I think fundamentally, for me, it's the value of time with family and friends. You know, life is hectic. And I think if I have that time, I value that more than anything.
I'd like to ask about history of art because it's one of those intriguing subjects to me. I brought it up a few times in this podcast. They show that when medical students take a module of that they actually have a better perspective for medical problems. And I'm sure it enriches your sense of breadth of the human experience. And you did this 20 years ago, so you still brought it into your workplace. Do you think it caused you to think differently?
Absolutely. I think when I came back to the industry, because that wasn't a given when I took the break, I definitely felt that I had, as you say, a much broader perspective. I mean, it is a subject that you can, I mean, it's so fabulously wide. I mean, you study everything from biblical passages, Greek mythology, architecture, music. It's just endless. It's a wonderful, wonderful journey. But I also found that I was able to connect with some clients that I didn't necessarily connect with very well. Once I discovered many of them had great collections of art. So we'd go down that rabbit hole, and it was a lovely rabbit hole to go down. And I really, really enjoyed that. But I think it is so important to have these outside interests because I think it does give you a fresh approach to problem solving. You know, it makes you realize there's a whole world out there. I mean, I think I always knew, but it enriches it further. So I regard it as a bit of a blessing that I came to find that this thing I really liked.
And also the complexity of the human condition. I think when you look at art and artists and how, in a way, tortured some of them were despite producing these brilliant works, I think it reminds you that really everybody maybe has a struggle and that we don't know. And when it comes to clients, sometimes tapping into this vulnerability is a way to build that connection and help them get to where they need to get.
Yeah, in fact, one of the first things that triggered my interest in art history, it's interesting you say that, was reading the book Lust for Life on Van Gogh's life. And there was a tortured soul, but a fabulous soul. And that's when I began to really become interested in art. So you're absolutely right. At the heart of it is passion and human life in all its shapes and forms.
And speaking of all its shapes and forms, now going to the reflection section, looking back at such a long and wonderful career, there must have been some highs and lows in there. I'd love to just ask if you can point to one or two. And the only reason I ask people to bring up the lows is because often there are lessons learned in there that they've maybe built on and learned from, and sharing them with us helps us all perhaps learn from that.
Absolutely. It's a learning curve, everything. So I think in terms of the highs, I would say, first of all, my first high really was when I was in Goodbody, and in the early 90s, I was, I suppose, promoted into a team leader role. And that was the first female-led team in a very male-dominated stockbroking industry. So that was really exciting for me. And the second one was achieving the top performing investment manager across 130 peers in Quilter Cheviot over a 5-year running period. And I think just to have that very clear, transparent performance figure, unequivocal, that you achieve for your clients on a sustained basis gave me probably the best satisfaction ever. So they're the highs, the two biggest highs, let's say. Lots of other good highs. In terms of lows, there's a bit of the elephant in the room. So I remember one particular review when my bonus was less than a male colleague who had the same level of revenue as I had, being told that he deserved a bigger bonus because basically he had a family to support and I was a single woman at the time. That did not make me very happy. Second one was slightly contentious in that I used to do a review of the pharmaceutical sector, and in my capacity I brought out a sell recommendation on a quoted Irish company. And I was told that my research was flawed and negligent and basically a lot of negatives thrown at me, and that I could lose my job if it turned out that I had based it on bad research. So it was sort of interesting in that I kind of held my own for the time, and I was given support by a very key figure in the company, which made a lot of the difference. But within a couple of months, that same company basically collapsed in value when it was discovered that they had been, if you like, giving a bad steer to the market in terms of the sales potential of some of its drugs in the pipeline. Now, ultimately, I was vindicated, but it was a very difficult journey. A lot of spotlight on me at the time. So I think the lessons that I took out of it was, first of all, understanding my own value. So I got very, very good about negotiating my package after that. And, maybe that's not a bad thing because women especially are really bad about negotiating their own financial terms, if you like. So I was not going to let that happen again. And then the second thing on the other experience was, one thing I was always very clear and good about was doing really good research. I wasn't flippant. So when I put out that recommendation, it was based on what I did my best. I really did the work. So I could stand on that, and I think that was the lesson I would say to anybody. A lot about any job really, but certainly in my experience, it's 90% perspiration, 10% inspiration. Hard work gets you a lot of places.
I think it also highlights the importance of conflicting views and dissent and generating dissent and not punishing dissent, but also respecting and shoring up people's right to dissent, even if you don't agree with it.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. It's not to say that, I could have been wrong, but I think it's how it's handled.
Yeah, exactly. And then around people. So you spoke a lot about people and the joy you get from being curious about people and speaking with them. Did you have any mentor or sponsor throughout this journey?
I had a few. I was thinking about this question. It's a great question. And I've always since encouraged younger people. I mentored a lot of young professionals coming through, and I always really encouraged them. So I did that, by the way, without realizing, but maybe it's because I have had some really good champions myself. But I'd say in my early career, my peers were actually my mentors in that sense, or people who influenced me. So for example, especially a lot of young women, we were all coming through at the same time, and we talked about a lot of things and how we were progressing our career. That was really valuable. Secondly, I was very fortunate in I had some great clients who really championed me, took a great interest in me. When I look back and I think, God, I was so young, but they obviously must have seen something and they really, really encouraged me. And in some cases gave me advice as to how to navigate my career, which was sort of unsought, but really valuable. I had some fantastic colleagues in the early days in Goodbody Stockbrokers. Really smart people, generous, and I benefited hugely from that. But I think fundamentally the most important influence in my life has been my parents. The qualities that they imparted to me were qualities of integrity, hard work, and curiosity. My dad in particular has a huge curiosity, academic curiosity. And that brings you a long way along the way. They also were very strong on sticking to your values, doing what you feel fulfilled by, working hard, but sticking to what feels good for you. And so they supported me through a lot and through some challenges. And that was in both life and in work.
In terms of wisdom, then, I can imagine those parents that were perhaps great sources of wisdom or creed or motto. And we've already talked about your investment beliefs and, again, some of these core beliefs and approach. Any kind of few things you can leave us with in terms of a creed or a motto or advice for your younger self, even?
Yeah, advice for younger self. So I think, I said I worked hard, and I did. I worked really, really hard. I think you also have to work smart. And I don't know that women are as good at that. I think maybe that's changing. I hope it is. My advice to your younger self would be get a good employment lawyer early on and negotiate those contracts for you, because we're not typically good at doing it ourselves. Get a life coach, both for work and life in general. It's a really good thing because we can be very busy down in the grass, but not necessarily looking at the bigger picture. And so I think that's really important to get some guidance, some independent voices outside of yourself. And really, after that, work hard. Work hard and do what you like and do what you enjoy and don't compromise on that.
Well, Ciara, thank you so much. I haven't known you for very long, but the small part we do overlap on the committee, I saw your attention to detail, your breadth, and your brilliance. And I knew when you were retiring, I had to be quick to capture this before we lost you to the galleries of Europe and trips to Italy and beyond. So I'm glad to hear we haven't lost you and that you'll still be involved in the industry. And thank you for coming here and sharing these considerable words of wisdom with us. And all I can say is enjoy exploring those other colours of the rainbow.
Thank you, Aoife.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.